Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Now, a worker employed by a South African firm was fired over what his employer said were threatening WhatsApp messages. The matter was brought before the CCMA, which found in favor of the employer. Let's find out if the Labour Relations Act recognizes the dismissal. And for that, we are joined by Zola, Mcaciso, a director at Mcaciso Stanfield Incorporated. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. What are the rules around this very popular messaging platform, which more and more businesses and employees are growing increasingly reliant on?
Thank you so much, and for good evening to the listeners and viewers as well. I think this new case by the CCMA confirms a view that was already adopted by the CCMA as early as 2014, insofar as misconduct that can be committed by employees on social media platforms. So, in essence, I think what we should take out from this is the fact that misconduct is misconduct, irrespective of which platform is committed on, whether on Facebook, LinkedIn, email, WhatsApp. Misconduct is misconduct. I think the issue is always whether or not the conduct of the employee has an impact on the employment relationship. So obviously, in terms of the Labour Relations Act, in order for the dismissal to be fair, the employer has to comply with both legs, one being the procedural aspect, being how the dismissal is effected, and the substantive fairness of it being the reason for the dismissal of the employee. So for so long as the employer follows a fair process, giving an employee an opportunity to state their case, giving them reasonable notice to prepare for the hearing, and for so long as the misconduct that they've committed is deemed as valid, it can justify a dismissal.
I mean, if you look at WhatsApp, it's a platform where people engage with their friends, informal chats and, conversations shared. But this now proves that it's become a lot more serious because it's now being used as a medium of communication in business, in work, and in more formally structured conversations.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think more and more employers, I think social media is becoming a part of our daily lives. And more employers are actually using these platforms, to conduct their operations. What most employers do in order to avoid issues of misconduct being committed on these platforms is that they adopt policies that regulate, how employees are supposed to conduct themselves in these various platforms. But what happened in this case, there was a WhatsApp group that belonged to the employer, where employees were discussing employee-related issues. So there was already a link between the WhatsApp group as a platform and the employment relationship. And what the employee did here is to send messages that are deemed as threatening to the WhatsApp group, where they were obviously seen by other colleagues in the workplace, where employee used words such as kill, such as stupid, making reference to the employer. And obviously the employer didn't take lightly to that. The employer saw it as a threat, and the employer had a policy in place which prescribed, what sanction must be imposed in cases where an employee makes threats of that nature against a colleague or a manager. So it was quite easy for the employer to be able to establish that there was a rule in the workplace in the form of obviously a policy, and that the rule prescribed this sanction that the employee must be dismissed. We know that in terms of the Labour Relations Act, first offence misconduct, it's generally inappropriate to dismiss employee for them, save for where the misconduct, of course, is so serious and so grave that it has a negative impact on the employment relationship, if it breaks the employment relationship intolerably, because we know that the employment relationship is founded on the principles of trust and good faith. So the CCMA recognized that an employee who sends messages of this nature to a WhatsApp web platform has committed serious misconduct which justifies a dismissal.
So what are some of the lessons that can be learned here, on this platform for employers and employees when it comes to perhaps a checklist of how you should be conducting yourself, what conversations should be had, and in what form?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that employers must have policies in place that clearly defines how employees should conduct themselves in these platforms and provide training to these employees on how they should conduct themselves in these platforms, because obviously these platforms are fairly new, especially their use in the context of an employment relationship. So clearly defined guidelines as how employees should conduct themselves will be very helpful. But also it's an opportunity for also employees to reflect on how they conduct themselves as well in these platforms, because in my view, and also if you consider the view that has been adopted by the CCMA, it does not matter whether or not the misconduct is committed on these platforms. It's a question of whether or not what the employee has done is a breach, of their duties as an employee. So if an employee would not ordinarily say something to a colleague face-to-face or in a meeting, if they wouldn't say that, then they shouldn't say it in these platforms, because, it may be viewed as serious misconduct.
What about the WhatsApp group, links when it comes to perhaps staff thinking that they can speak amongst themselves on this group, and, can they now be held to account if one of the members shares what was discussed on that group, irrespective of whether or not management was present within that group?
Yeah. So obviously, when it comes to issues of misconduct and employment law, each case is to be dealt with on its own merits. If an employee, if they're having a private conversation, but even if it's a private conversation, if the employee conducts himself or herself in a manner that is inappropriate, and that comes to light to the employer will obviously have to investigate and establish whether or not what was said in that private conversation has an impact in the employment relationship. For example, if two employees are having a private chat and they're speaking about issues of racism on a social media, on a WhatsApp platform, and it comes to light to the employer will be able to establish a case to say, what was discussed and the views that are expressed by this employee, even if it was discussed privately, it has come to light to the employer, and the employer does not associate itself with an employee who holds such a view. The employer cannot trust this employee. So for so long as the employer is able to establish a sufficient link between the conduct of the employee in these platforms and the employment relationship, and is able to establish that they can no longer trust the employee going forward, the employer will be able to justify the dismissal.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. Some very important elements coming through with this conversation. Some lessons, of course, on the WhatsApp messaging platform, what to do and what not to do. Zola Mcaciso, a director at Mcaciso Stanfield Incorporated.